I think it's important to understand that when I began to make films, it was really at a moment before this transition to digital that I started making films in Super 8, and really the first films I made were silent. I remember the process of putting a magnetic stripe on the Super 8 film. It was a special machine. And then it was transitioning to 16 millimeter, again silent, hand cranked, Bolex. And then the process of putting sound on that was also very complicated. It required another mechanical process. And then graduating eventually to 35. All of this seems very antiquated now with the digital revolution. But my formation is based very much on this notion of the material aspect of film. I remember very clearly the physical act of cutting the film, and also from my childhood, my father took home movies of our life in Egypt. So before we came to Canada, I have all of these images of Egypt and my childhood. So I always associated this with these boxes of small spools of film, and my memory and my own sense of my origin is tied into this trove. It's like almost like it's very physical. So the physical aspect of film is part of my formation. It's difficult maybe to understand now, but it was really essential to how I developed as a filmmaker. Also the graduation from Super 8, silent, to sound, to 16 millimeter with sound, to 35 millimeter with mono sound, stereo sound. Each of these steps were part of my formation. For a young filmmaker now, this is very different. You have digital and it's all there. The technology, you can shoot it with an iPhone and it's going to be professional quality. But this is an important part of understanding what my obsessions are, is the idea that we had in film something that was fragile, that could be broken, that could be scratched, that could be, it was like our body. So a lot of my investigations through installation work is to do with this notion of the material aspect of film and how vulnerable it is, how it can be damaged, how it can gather dust, how it can be scratched, and how, in a way, it's this idea, almost a biblical idea of the graven image. You know that in the Old Testament there's this question of the image as being physically graven. But we've lost this now. But I suppose my work is an attempt to keep this aspect of my own formation alive, but use it also as a metaphor for how we process our own history.
Like when I was in short trousers. Went to sleep and fell off the pew.
In terms of the installation that I did, Steenbeckett, I was very aware of the fact that when I was shooting this last shot, which was 20 minutes long, this is 2,000 feet of 35 millimeter film. And I was very impressed by the notion of how much material space that creates and how compact it is when it's organized into a spool. But what happens when you unspool it? When it becomes something that's suspended in a cloud of film? Because in a way, this represents the, again, the vulnerability of this process, how it can be affected by age, by all types of contamination, the contamination of dust that's on the film, but also when people come into the installation, if they touch the film, it will be destroyed. So all of this seems to work as a metaphor for how frail our own memory is, but also the notion of preservation and manipulation. That if you have objects, you need to place those objects somewhere. And you have to be aware of where they're placed. The archival process becomes actually a physical one as opposed to an abstract one. And so therefore we have a custodial responsibility which seems to be very different from a digital preservation. So But I'm not so interested now in the actual aspect of it as it works, but rather the way it serves as a metaphor. That there's something appealing about this notion that we are able to corrupt and protect and somehow preserve this place that our memories are stored in. And in many of the films, the characters are actually involved with that process. My new film, the one I'm just finishing, very much involves how before there was a cloud, images were kept on a cell phone, and that the cell phone itself becomes a repository. There's no place that the images are going to be translated to. You have to preserve this piece of technology. So once it's an extension of our body, but of course it's very separate because it's this foreign object. In my fantasy, the audience walks around and the audience interacts, but in fact, as human beings, we tend to be very conservative or suspicious, and it's interesting, we prefer to watch, and the act, in my fantasy, the audience is really investigating this space, but very often I find it that people are not so curious, that they want to actually just watch. So when I design these installations, they're meant to be physical, like a playground, like a child goes and plays in the sand and plays with toys, that I'm inviting the audience to come in and play with this. But most of the time people are cautious. They're not sure. So the two installations today, I was showing both Steenbeckett and also 8.5 screens. In my fantasy, the people are really inside the installation, and they're playing with it, but this doesn't happen very often. For instance, today when I was showing my documentation, I have a camera and I'm going through the piece as I would like someone else to observe it, but that's not necessarily how they absorb. So in that way, it's a good question. Which is the more authoritarian version? I'm not sure. The question is also, film should be projected on a large screen, but very often we don't see it that way anymore. So, and also cinema, ideally, we cannot interrupt the time. The film will proceed whether or not we're there. Right now, as we're talking, a film is playing downstairs. That is an act of cinema. It is playing, I have no control over it. We don't know what the response is in the audience right now, but it's cinema. It is going on itself, as opposed to watching it on a cell phone or on a computer where I have control, I will pause it, I will manipulate it the way I want. So that's not very authoritarian. What I like about an installation like Steenbeckett is that this machine is moving and it's powered by its own device. And you see that this is an operation that you have no control over. However, you're correct. If you choose to be aggressive, you can stop it very easily. You can turn off the machine, you can grab the film, but in a way, people are not that adventurous. Again, I'm coming from theater. So theater, as a process, you're very aware of the artificiality of it. I mean, when you walk into a theater and when you see the actors come on stage and you see the sets, you know that it's artifice. So you have to work that much harder. You have to really invest yourself in order to make it function. And the actors have to really do an amazing job of bringing you into their reality. And I think that in cinema, because the camera so quickly represents reality, I've always been interested in preserving that sense of theatrical interaction. I mean, it's a natural process for me. Because you're right, that film is full of so many formulas which create a kind of a seamlessness that you're not aware of how time is being manipulated. But I find that by making the viewer aware of that it creates even more excitement. But it really, things are changing very quickly. Like audiences are changing, and maybe this is almost becoming like a lost language. However, like even if it's digital technology, if you hold a shot for a long time, whether it's shot on film or if it's digital, notions of duration and tolerance are the same. The difference is that with film, there was a moment where people understood that a long shot was an investment of resources, which it's not anymore. Now it's just a hard drive memory. It doesn't really require the same type of commitment as it did when we were shooting on film. I think that cinema has a very particular place because it's about commitment. It's about a commitment to a viewer's sense of participation, and it's almost like the difference between a novel and a short story. That when I watch now like a TV series, which is becoming the way that we watch drama, that the TV series is novelistic in form. It is able to just keep growing. And in the way that like the novels of Dostoevsky or Flaubert or Dickens, when they were first introduced, they were serialized in much the same way. Every week there would be a new edition, a new chapter. But the feature film is like the short story. It's its own form. And in a sense it has its own rules. And it's becoming almost it's becoming quite marginal in our culture. You know, let's remember that the feature film was originally designed because in the cinemas there had to be two projections, one at 7 o'clock, one at 9 o'clock. And so the feature film was an hour and a half to 2 hours to fit this format. And a whole generation of artists grew accustomed to this structure, but it came from an industrial place. And we accommodated it and we made it into a language. But it's quite possible that this is becoming actually irrelevant, that the films that are being scheduled at 7 and 9 o'clock are commercial films, and that the artistic cinema can be any length. It doesn't necessarily need to be a feature length. It could be, so I'm finding that difficult to understand, but that's the reality of where we are now. We are in a transitional place. And when I look at the 18 features I've made, they were made with this very strict sense of how long they could be, and the structure was made to accommodate that. But I'm aware that this is shifting, that this is changing, even though it's the language I know best.